Welcome, everybody, to another of my storytelling with Sadler. This time I'm going to be talking about this great short story by Stephen Vincent Benét called The King of the Cats. It's one that I have loved since I was a kid. I don't remember exactly when I first read it. It was in an anthology, and some of you may be familiar with these. Alfred Hitchcock presents anthologies. My uncle Hubert, I've talked about this in other videos. Every Christmas for about 5 or 6 years, he would get me one of these books: Haunted Houseful, Sinister Spies, Tales of Terror and Suspense. And they would have all these great anthologies of wonderful stories that weren't actually so much just for children, but could be appreciated by adults. And this is one of those that I particularly liked as a kid. And I've gone back to it a number of times, sometimes just in reading it, and have really enjoyed it over the course of my life. So I'm going to read this story to you. You can feel free to comment whatever you want in the live chat. And then after I'm done, I'll address the comments and probably tell you a little bit more about what I find particularly cool and compelling about this short story. So, with no further ado, let's get started. The King of the Cats by Stephen Vincent Benét. "But my dear," said Mr. Culverin with a tiny gasp, "you can't actually mean a tail?" Mrs. Dingle nodded impressively. "Exactly. I've seen him twice. Paris, of course, and then a command appearance at Rome. We were in the royal box. He conducted, my clear. You've never heard such effects from an orchestra. And my dear," she hesitated slightly, "he conducted with it." "How perfectly, fascinatingly, too horrid for words," said Mrs. Culverin in a dazed but greedy voice. "We must have him to dinner as soon as he comes over. He is coming over, isn't he?" "The 12th," said Mrs. Dingle with a gleam in her eyes. "The new symphony people have asked him to be guest conductor for 3 special concerts. I do hope you can dine with us some night while he's here. He'll be very busy, of course, but he's promised to give us what time he can spare." "Oh, thank you, dear," said Mrs. Culverlin abstractedly, her last raid upon Mrs. Dingle's pet British novelist still fresh in her mind. "You're always so delightfully hospitable, but you mustn't wear yourself out. The rest of us must do our part. I know Henry and myself would be only too glad to." That's very sweet of you, darling." Mrs. Dingle also remembered the larceny of the British novelist. "But we're going to give Monsieur Tibault — sweet name, isn't it? They say he's descended from the Tibault in Romeo and Juliet, and that's why he doesn't like Shakespeare. We're going to give Monsieur Tibault the simplest sort of time, a little reception after his first concert, perhaps. He hates," she looked around the table, "large, mixed parties. And then, of course, with his her little idiosyncrasy," she coughed delicately, "it makes him feel a trifle shy with strangers." "But I don't understand yet, Aunt Emily," said Tommy Brooks, Mrs. Dingle's nephew. "Do you really mean this Tibault bozo has a tail, like a monkey and everything?" "Tommy, dear," said Mrs. Culverlin crushingly, "in the first place, Monsieur Tibault is not a bozo. He is a very distinguished musician, the finest conductor in Europe. And in the second place, he has," Mrs. Dingle was firm, "he has a tail. He conducts with it." "Oh, but honestly," said Tommy, his ears pinkening, "I mean, of course, if you say so, Aunt Emily, I'm sure he has, but still it sounds pretty steep, if you know what I mean. How about it, Professor Tato?" Professor Tato cleared his throat. He put his fingertips together cautiously. "I shall be very anxious to see this Monsieur Thibault. For myself, I have never observed a genuine specimen of Homo caudatus, so I should be inclined to doubt. And yet, in the Middle Ages, for instance, the belief in men tailed or with caudal appendages of some sort was widespread, and as we can gather, well founded. As late as the 18th century, a Dutch sea captain with Some character for veracity recounts the discovery of such a pair of creatures on the island of Formosa. They were in a low state of civilization, I believe, but the appendages in question were quite distinct. And in 1860, Dr. Grimbook, the English surgeon, claims to have treated no less than 3 African natives with short, though his testimony rests upon unsupported word. After all, the thing is not impossible, though doubtless unusual. Web feet, rudimentary gills, these occur with some frequency. The appendix we have with us always. The chain of our descent from the ape-like form is by no means complete. For that matter, he beamed around the table, what we can call the last few vertebrae of the normal spine, but the beginnings of a concealed and rudimentary tail. Oh, yes, it's possible. Quite that in an extraordinary case, a reversion to type, a survival, though, of course. I told you so, said Mrs. Dingle triumphantly. Isn't it fascinating? Isn't it, princess? The princess, Vivekanarda's eyes, blue as a field of larkspur, fathomless as the center of heaven, rested for a moment on Mrs. Dingle's excited countenance. Very fascinating, she said in a voice like stroked golden velvet. I should like very much to meet this Monsieur Tibault. Well, I hope he breaks his neck, said Tommy Brooks under his breath, but nobody paid much attention to Tommy. Nevertheless, as the time for Mr. Tibault's arrival in these states grew nearer and nearer, people in general began to wonder whether the princess had spoken quite truthfully, for there was no doubt of the fact that up till then she'd been the unique sensation of the season. And you know what social lions and lionesses are. It was, if you remember, a Siamese season, and genuine Siamese were quite as much of a premium as Russian accents had been in the quaint old days when the chauve-souris was a novelty. The Siamese art theater, imported at terrific expense, was playing to packed houses. Gushupzugu, an epic novel of Siamese farm life in 19 closely printed volumes, had just been awarded the Nobel Prize. Prominent pet and newt dealers reported no cessation in the appalling demand for Siamese cats. And on the crest of this wave of interest in things Siamese, the Princess Vivekanarda poised with the elegant nonchalance of a Hawaiian water baby upon its surfboard. She was indispensable. She was incomparable. She was everywhere. Youthful, enormously wealthy, allied on one hand to the royal family of Siam and on the other to the Cabots, and yet with the first 18 of her 21 years shrouded from speculation in a golden zone of mystery, the mingling of races in her had produced an exotic beauty as distinguished as it was strange. She moved with feline, effortless grace, and her skin was as if it had just been gently powdered with tiny grains of the purest gold. Yet the blueness of her eyes, set just a trifle slantingly, was as pure and startling as the sea on the rocks of Maine. Her brown hair fell to her knees. She had been ordered extraordinary sums by the Master Barbers Protective Association to have it shingled. Straight as a waterfall tumbling over brown rocks, it had a vague perfume of sandalwood and suave spices and held tints of rust and the sun. She did not talk very much, but then she did not have to. Her voice had an odd, small melodiousness, huskiness that haunted the mind. She lived alone and was reputed to be very lazy. At least it was known she slept during most of the day. But at night she bloomed like a moonflower, and a depth came into her eyes. It was no wonder that Tommy Brooks fell in love with her. The wonder was that she let him. There was nothing exotic or distinguished about Tommy. He was just one of those pleasant, normal young men who seemed to carry on the bond business by reading the newspapers in the university club during most of the day and can always be relied upon at night to fill in an unexpected hole in a dinner party. It is true that the princess could hardly be said to do more than tolerate any of her suitors. No one had ever seen those aloofly arrogant eyes enliven at the entrance of any male, but she seemed to be able to tolerate Tommy a little bit more than the rest, and that young man's infatuated daydreams were beginning to be beset by smart solitaires and imaginary apartments on Park Avenue when the famous Mr. Tibault conducted his first concert at Carnegie Hall. Tommy Brooks sat beside the princess. The eyes he turned upon her were eyes of longing and love, but her face was impassive as a mask, and the only remark she made during the preliminary bustlings was that there seemed to be a number of people in the audience. But Tommy was relieved, if anything, to find her even a little more aloof than usual, for ever since Mrs. Culverin's dinner party, a vague disquiet as to the possible impression which this Tibault creature might make upon her had been growing in his mind. It shows his devotion that he was present at all. To a man whose simple Princetonian nature found in just a little love, a little kiss, the quintessence of musical art, the average symphony was a positive torture, and he looked forward to the evening's program itself with a grim, brave smile. "Shh," said Mrs. Dingle breathlessly. "He's coming." It seemed to the startled Tommy as if he were suddenly back in the trenches under a heavy barrage as Monsieur Tibault made his entrance to a perfect bombardment of applause. Then the enthusiastic noise was sliced off in the middle, and a gasp took its place, a vast windy sigh, as if every person in that multitude had suddenly said, "Ah," for the papers had not lied about him. The tale was there. They called him theatric, but how well he understood the uses of theatricalism. Dressed in the unrelieved black from head to foot, the black dress shirt had been a special token of Mussolini's esteem. He did not walk on, he strolled leisurely, easily, aloofly, the famous tail curled nonchalantly about one wrist, a suave black panther lounging through a summer garden with that little mysterious weave of the head that panthers have when they pad behind bars, the glittering darkness of his eyes unmoved by any surprise or elation. He nodded twice in regal acknowledgement as the clapping reached an apogee of frenzy. To Tommy, there was something dreadfully reminiscent of the princess in the way he nodded. Then he turned to his orchestra. A second and louder gasp went up from the audience at this point, for as he turned, the tip of that incredible tail twined with dainty carelessness into some hidden pocket and produced a black baton. Tommy did not even notice. He was looking at the princess instead. She'd not bothered to clap at first, but now he'd never seen her move like this. Never. She was not applauding. Her hands were clenched in her lap, but her whole body was rigid, rigid as a steel bar, and the blue flowers of her eyes were bent on the figure of Monsieur Tibault in a terrible concentration. The pose of her entire figure was so still and intense that for an instant, Tommy had the lunatic idea that any moment she might leap from her seat beside him as lightly as a moth and land with no sound at Monsieur Tibault's side to rub her proud head against his coat in worship. Even Mrs. Dingle would notice in a moment. "Princess," he said in a horrified whisper. "Princess." Slowly, the tenseness of her body relaxed. Her eyes veiled again. She grew calm. "Yes, Tommy," she said in her usual voice, but there was still something about her. "Nothing. Oh, hang, he's starting," said Tommy, as Monsieur Tibault, his hands loosely clasped before him, turned and faced the audience. His eyes dropped, his tail switched once impressively, and then gave 3 preliminary taps with his baton on the floor. Seldom has Gluck's overture to Iphigenie in Aulis received such an ovation, but it was not until the Eighth Symphony that the hysteria of the audience reached its climax. Never before had the new symphony played so superbly, and certainly never before had it been led with such genius. 3 prominent conductors in the audience were sobbing with the despairing admiration of envious children towards the close, and one at least was heard to offer wildly $10,000 to a well-known facial surgeon there present for a shred of evidence that tales of some variety could, by any stretch of science, be grafted on a normally decaudative form. There was no doubt about it. No mortal hand and arm, be they ever so dexterous, could combine the delicate elan and powerful grace displayed in every gesture of Monsieur Tibault's tail. A sable staff, it dominated the brasses like a flicker of black lightning, an ebon, elusive whip. It drew the last exquisite breath of melody from the woodwinds and ruled the stormy strings like a magician's rod. Monsieur Tibault bowed and bowed again. Roar after roar of frenzied admiration shook the hall to its foundations. And when he finally staggered, exhausted, from the platform, the president of the Wednesday Sonata Club was only restrained by force from flinging her $90,000 string of pearls after him in an excess of aesthetic appreciation. New York had come and seen, and New York was conquered. Mrs. Dingle was immediately besieged by reporters, and Tommy Brooks looked forward to the little party at which he was to meet the new hero of the hour with feelings only a little less lugubrious than those that would have come to him just before taking his seat in the electric chair. The meeting between his princess and Monsieur Tibault was worse and better than he expected. Because, after all, they did not say much to each other, and worse because it seemed to him that somehow some curious kinship of mind between them made words unnecessary. They were certainly the most distinguished looking couple in the room as he bent over her hand. So darlingly foreign, both of them, and yet so different, babbled Mrs. Dingle, but Tommy couldn't agree. They were different, yes. The dark, lithe stranger with the bizarre appendage tucked carelessly in his pocket, and the blue-eyed, brown-haired girl. But that difference only accentuated what they had in common, something in the way they moved, in the suavity of their gestures, in the set of their eyes, something deeper even than race. He tried to puzzle it out. Then, looking around at the others, he had a flash of revelation. It was as if the couple were foreign indeed, not only to New York, but to all common humanity, as if they were polite guests from a different star. Tommy did not have a very happy evening on the whole, but his mind worked slowly, and it was not until much later that the mad suspicion came on him in full force. Perhaps he's not to be blamed for his lack of immediate comprehension. The next few weeks were weeks of bewildered misery for him. It was not that the princess's attitude towards him had changed. She was just as tolerant of him as before, but Monsieur Tibault was always there. He had a faculty of appearing as out of thin air. He walked, for all of his height, as lightly as a butterfly. And Tommy grew to hate that faintest shuffle on the carpet that announced his presence. And then hang it all, the man was so smooth, so infernally, unruffably smooth. He was never out of temper, never embarrassed. He treated Tommy with the extreme of urbanity, and yet his eyes mocked deep down, and Tommy could do nothing. And gradually the princess became more and more drawn to this stranger in a soundless communion that found little need for speech. And that, too, Tommy saw and hated, and that, too, he could not mend. He began to be haunted not only by Monsieur Tibault in the flesh, but by Monsieur Tibault in the spirit. He slept badly, and when he slept, he dreamed of Monsieur Tibault, a man no longer but a shadow, a specter, the limber ghost of an animal whose words came purringly between sharp little pointed teeth. There was certainly something odd about the whole shape of the fellow, his fluid ease, the mold of his head, even the cut of his fingernails. But just what it was escaped Tommy's intensest cogitation. And when he did put his finger on it at length, at first, he refused to believe. A pair of petty incidents decided him finally against all reason. He'd gone to Mrs. Dingle's one winter afternoon hoping to find the princess. She was out with his aunt, but she was expected back for tea, and he wandered idly into the library to wait. He was just about to switch on the lights, for the library was always dark even in summer, when he heard a sound of light breathing that seemed to come from the leather couch in the corner. He approached it, cautiously and dimly made out the form of Monsieur Tibault curled up on the couch, peacefully asleep. The sight annoyed Tommy so that he swore under his breath and was back near the door on his way out when the feeling we all know and hate, the feeling that eyes we cannot see are watching, arrested him. He turned back. Monsieur Thibault had not moved a muscle of his body to all appearance, but his eyes were open now. And those eyes were black and human no longer. They were green. Tommy could have sworn it, and he could have sworn that they had no bottom and gleamed like emeralds in the dark. It only lasted a moment, for Tommy pressed the light button automatically, and there was Monsieur Thibault, his normal self, yawning a little, but urbanely apologetic. But it gave Tommy time to think. Nor did what happened a trifle later increase his peace of mind. They had lit a fire and were talking in front of it. By now, Tommy hated Monsieur Thibault so thoroughly that he felt the odd yearning for his company that often occurs in such cases. Monsieur Thibault was telling some anecdote, and Tommy was hating him worse than ever for basking with such obvious enjoyment in the heat of the flames and the ripple of his own voice. Then they heard the street door open, and Monsieur Tibault jumped up, and jumping caught one sock on the sharp corner of the brass fire rail and tore it open in a jagged flap. Tommy looked down mechanically at the tear, a second's glance, but enough. For Monsieur Tibault, for the first time in Tommy's experience, lost his temper completely. He swore violently in some spitting foreign tongue. His face distorted suddenly. He clasped his hand over the sock. Then, glaring furiously at Tommy, he fairly sprang from the room, and Tommy could hear him scaling the stairs in long, agile bounds. Tommy sank into a chair, careless for once of the fact that he heard the princess's light laugh in the hall. He didn't want to see the princess. He didn't want to see anybody. There had been something revealed when Mr. Tibault had torn that hole in his sock, and it was not the skin of a man. Tommy had caught a glimpse of black plush, black velvet, and then had come Monsieur Thibault's sudden explosion of fury. Good Lord, did the man wear black velvet stockings under his ordinary socks? Or could he? Could he? But here Tommy held his fevered head in his hands. He went to Professor Tato that evening with a series of hypothetical questions, but as he did not dare confide his real suspicions to the professor, the hypothetical answers he received served only to confuse him the more. Then he thought of Billy Strange. Billy was of a good sort, and his mind had a turn for the bizarre. Billy might be able to help. He couldn't get a hold of Billy for 3 days and lived through the interval in a fever of impatience. But finally, they had dinner together at Billy's apartment, where his queer books were, and Tommy was able to blurt out the whole disordered jumble of his suspicions. Billy listened without interrupting until Tommy was quite through. Then he pulled at his pipe. "But my dear man," he said protestingly. "Oh, I know," said Tommy and waved his hands. "I know I'm crazy. You needn't tell me that, but I tell you, the man's a cat all the same. No, I don't see how he could be, but he is. Why, hang it, in the first place, everyone knows he's got a tail." "Even so," said Billy, puffing. "Oh, my dear Tommy, I don't doubt that you saw or think that you saw everything you say, but even so," he shook his head. "But what about those other birds, werewolves and things?" said Tommy. Billy looked dubious. "Well," he admitted, "you've got me there, of course. At least a tailed man is possible. And the yarns about werewolves go back far enough so that, well, I wouldn't say there aren't or haven't been werewolves, but then I'm willing to believe more things than most people. But a were-cat, or a man that's a cat and a cat that's a man? Honestly, Tommy, if I don't get some real advice, I'll go clean off my hinge. For heaven's sake, tell me something to do." "Let me think," said Billy. "First, you're pissing sure this man is a cat." "Yeah." And Tommy nodded violently. "Check. And second, if it doesn't hurt your feelings, Tommy, you're afraid this girl you're in love with has a streak of felinity in her, and so she's drawn to him." "Oh, Lord, Billy, if only I knew." "Well, suppose she really is, too, Would you still be keen on her?" "I'd marry her if she turned into a dragon every Wednesday," said Tommy fervently. Billy smiled. He said. "Then the obvious thing to do is to get rid of this Monsieur Thibault." "Let me think." He thought about 2 pipes full while Tommy sat on pins and needles, and then finally he burst out laughing. What's so darn funny? Said Tommy aggrievedly. Nothing, Tommy, only I've just thought of a stunt. Something so blooming crazy, but if he is what you think he is, it might work. And going to the bookcase, he took down a book. If you think you're going to quiet my nerves by reading me a bedtime story, shut up, Tommy, and listen to this. If you really want to get rid of your feline friend, what is it? Book of Agnes Repler's about cats. Listen. There is also a Scandinavian version of the ever-famous story which Sir Walter Scott told to Washington Irving, which Monk Lewis told to Shelley, and which in one form or another we find embodied in the folklore of every land. Now, Tommy, pay attention. The story of the traveler who saw within a ruined abbey a procession of cats lowering into a grave, a little coffin with a crown upon it. Filled with horror, he hastened from the spot, but when he'd reached his destination, he could not forbear telling to a friend the wonder he'd seen. Scarcely had the tale been told when his friend's cat, who laid curled up tranquilly by the fire, sprang to his feet, cried out, "Then I am the king of cats!" and disappeared in a flash up the chimney. Well, said Billy, shutting the book. By gum, said Tommy, staring. By gum, do you think there's a chance? I think we're both in the booby hatch, but if you want to try it, try it. I'll spring it on him the next time I see him. But listen, I can't make it a ruined abbey. Oh, use your imagination. Make it Central Park, anywhere. Tell it as if it happened to you, seeing the funeral procession and all that. You can lead into it somehow. Let's see, some general line. Oh, yes. Strange, isn't it? How, in fact, so often copies fiction. Why, only yesterday. See? Strange, isn't it? How fact so often copies fiction, repeated Tommy dutifully. Why, only yesterday. I happened to be strolling through Central Park when I saw something very odd. I happened to be strolling through. Here, give me that book, said Tommy. I want to learn the rest of it by heart. Mrs. Dingle's farewell dinner to the famous Monsieur Tibault on the occasion of his departure for his Western tour was looked forward to with the greatest expectations. Not only would everybody be there, including the Princess Vivrecanarda, but Mrs. Dingle, a hinter if there ever was one, had let it be known that at this dinner an announcement of a very unusual interest to society might be made. So everyone, for once, was almost on time, except for Tommy. He was at least 15 minutes early, for he wanted to have speech with his aunt alone. Unfortunately, however, he had hardly taken off his overcoat when she was whispering some news in his ear so rapidly he found it difficult to understand a word of it. And you mustn't breathe it to a soul, she ended beamingly. That is, not before the announcement. I think we'll have that with the salad. People never pay much attention to salad. Breathe what, Aunt Emily? Said Tommy, confused. The princess, darling, the dear princess and Monsieur Tibault. They just got engaged this afternoon, dear things. Isn't it fascinating? Yeah, said Tommy, and he started to walk blindly through the nearest door. His aunt restrained him. Not there, dear. Not in the library. You can congratulate them later. They're just having a sweet little moment alone in there now. And she turned away to Harry the butler, leaving Tommy stunned. But his chin came up after a moment. He wasn't beaten yet. Strange, isn't it, how often fact copies fiction, he repeated to himself in dull mnemonics. And as he did, he shook his fist at the library door. Mrs. Dingle was wrong as usual. The princess and Monsieur Tibault were not in the library. They were in the conservatory, as Tommy discovered when he wandered aimlessly past the glass doors. He didn't mean to look, and after a second he turned away. But that second was enough. Tibault was seated on a chair and she was crouched on a stool at his side while his hands smoothly, softly stroked her black hair, black cat and Siamese kitten. Her face was hidden from Tommy, but he could see Tibault's face and he could hear. They were not talking, but there was a sound between them, a warm and contented sound, like the murmur of giant bees in a hollow tree, a golden musical rumble, deep-throated, that came from Tibault's lips and was answered by hers, a golden purr. Tommy found himself back in the drawing room. shaking hands with Mrs. Culverin, who said, frankly, she had seldom seen him look so pale. The first two courses of the dinner passed Tommy like dreams, but Mrs. Dingle's cellar was notable, and in the middle of the meat course, he had begun to come to himself. He had only one resolve now. For the next few minutes, he tried desperately to break into the conversation, but Mrs. Dingle was talking, and even Gabriel will have a hard time interrupting Mrs. Dingle. At last, though, she paused for breath, and Tommy saw his chance. Speaking of that, said Tommy piercingly, without knowing in the least what he was referring to. Speaking of that, as I was saying, said Professor Tato, but Tommy would not yield. The plates were being taken away. It was time for salad. Speaking of that, he said again, so loudly and strangely that Mrs. Culverin jumped and an awkward hush fell over the table. Strange, isn't it, how often fact copies fiction? There he was started. His voice rose even higher. Why, only today I was strolling through, and word for word he repeated his lesson. He could see Tibault's eyes glowing at him as he described the funeral. He could see the princess tense. He could not have said what he expected might happen when he came to the end, but it was not bored silence everywhere, to be followed by Mrs. Dingle's acrid, well, Tommy, is that quite all? He slumped back into his chair, and sick at heart, he was a fool. His last resource had failed. Dimly, he heard his aunt's voice saying, well then, and realized she was about to make the fatal announcement. But then, just then, Mr. Tibault spoke. One moment, Mrs. Dingle, he said with extreme politeness, and she was silent. He turned to Tommy. You are positive, I suppose, of what you saw this afternoon, Brooks? He said in tones of light mockery. Absolutely, said Tommy sullenly. Do you think I'd? Oh, no, 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 no. Mr. Tibault waved the implication aside. But such an interesting story. One likes to be sure of the details. And of course, you are sure, quite sure, that that kind of crown you describe was on the coffin? Of course, said Tommy, wondering. But then I'm the king of cats, cried Monsieur Tibault in a voice of thunder, and even as he cried it, the house lights blinked. There was the soft thud of an explosion that seemed muffled in cotton wool from the minstrel gallery, and the scene was lit for a second by an obliterating and painful burst of light that vanished in an instant and was succeeded by heavy, blinding clouds of white, pungent smoke. Oh, these horrid photographers, came Mrs. Dingle's voice in a melodious wail. I told them not to take the flashlight picture till dinner was over, and now they've taken it just as I was nibbling lettuce. Someone tittered a little nervously. Someone coughed. Then gradually the veils of smoke dislimed, and the green and black spots in front of Tommy's eyes died away. They were blinking at each other like people who've just come out of a cave into brilliant sun. Even yet, their eyes stung with the fierceness of that abrupt illumination, and Tommy found it hard to make out the faces across the table from him. Mrs. Dingle took command of the half-blinded company with her accustomed poise. She rose, glass in hand. And now, dear friends, she said in a clear voice, I'm sure all of us are very happy to. Then she stopped, open-mouthed, an expression of incredulous horror on her features. The lifted glass began to spill its contents on the tablecloth in a little stream of amber. As she spoke, she had turned directly to Monsieur Tibault's place at the table, and Monsieur Tibault was no longer there. Some say there was a bursting flash of fire that disappeared up the chimney. Some say it was a giant cat that leaped through the window at a bound without breaking the glass. Professor Tato puts it down to a mysterious chemical disturbance operating only over Monsieur Tibault's chair. The butler, who is pious, believes the devil in person flew away with him. And Mrs. Dingle hesitates between witchcraft and a malicious ectoplasm dematerializing on the wrong cosmic plane. Be that as it may, one thing is certain. In the instant of fictive darkness which followed the glare of the flashlight, Monsieur Tibault, the great conductor, disappeared from mortal sight, tail and all. Mrs. Culverin swears he was an international burglar and she was just about to unmask him when he slipped away under cover of the flashlight smoke, but no one else who sat at the historic dinner table believes her. No, there are no sound explanations, but Tommy thinks he knows, and he will never be able to pass a cat again without wondering. Mrs. Tommy is quite of her husband's mind regarding cats. She was Gretchen Woolwine of Chicago, for Tommy told her the whole story. And while she doesn't believe a great deal of it, there is no doubt in her heart no doubt in her heart that one person concerned in the affair was a perfect cat. Doubtless, it would have been more romantic to relate how Tommy's daring finally won him his princess, but unfortunately, it would not be veracious. For the princess, Vivekananda, alas, is with us no longer. Her nerves, shattered by the spectacular denouement of Mrs. Dingle's dinner, required a sea voyage, and from that voyage she has never returned to America. Of course, there are the usual stories. One hears of her, a nun in a Siamese convent, or a masked dancer at the Le Jardin de Monsieur. One hears that she has been murdered in Patagonia or married in Trebizond, but as far as can be ascertained, not one of these gaudy fables has the slightest basis in fact. I believe that Tommy, in his heart of hearts, is quite convinced that the sea voyage was only a pretext, and that by some unheard of means she has managed to join the formidable Monsieur Tibault, wherever in the world of the visible or the invisible he may be. In fact, that in some ruined city or subterranean palace, they reign together now, king and queen of all the mysterious kingdom of cats. But that, of course, is quite impossible. And that is the ending of The King of the Cats by Stephen Vincent Benét. So, wonderful storytelling there. While you're writing comments, if you want to say anything or ask anything or remark anything, I'm going to point out that there's some really cool features to this story. One of the ones that I didn't, of course, grasp as a kid, but something that I was quite interested in as a philosopher later on is what we call intertextuality, right? So this is a story that is kind of a reinterpretation, a redo of an older story. And those older stories are not only being referenced within this story, right? The updated version, a 20th century version, but it's the older stories are being used as aids, as tools within this story. And it just turns out that we've got a really smart friend who's into things weird and he knows this story, right? So that's kind of a cool feature of this. And Benet is a great author. If you haven't read, some of his other stuff, I'd recommend going out there and checking him out. He was quite renowned in early 20th century stuff. But this is a really interesting piece. And it looks like as I mentioned, I encountered this within an Alfred Hitchcock anthology, but it's actually from a very interestingly titled book of short stories, which is hard to get your hands on, unfortunately, called 13 O'Clock Stories of Several Worlds. And just as a side note, I love that sort of notion of 13 o'clock, weird numbers. My dad, when he was asked about things, numbers, he would often say 11, this imaginary number that doesn't exist. And, there's also, a great song by Savatage, 25 hours ago, these kind of strange playing around with numbers, opening up a space, a liminal space that shouldn't be there, but actually is. And this is part of the essence of weird supernatural stories, of fantasy, of science fiction, of horror, of speculative fiction in general. And so this is a really fun story. And I think that, the characters are pretty well, in sort of just outlines, right? Sketched out for us. We've got some that are kind of stereotype stock characters, but I think this is quite an interesting piece. So I'd be interested to see what the rest of you make of this story. I'm actually going to be heading out, speaking of cats, in just a little bit after we finish up here to the Almost Home Cat Rescue. where I will be hanging out with the cats for an hour or two, giving them some attention, some pets, some love and care, and getting my weekly cat fix. They've got a whole new bunch that came in from Texas just a week ago. So, what's on your mind about this story? Anything that you want to bring up or ask about or remark? I'll say too, while I'm waiting to see if anybody's going to write something, it's kind of fun doing this stuff with multiple characters. It's been a long time since I read stories out loud. I did them with my kids when they were very young, and my kids are now in high school and college, so I don't do a lot of story reading. It's kind of fun to like take on different voices and do the, what would you call it, the changing tempos of the narration. And like, I know where the story is going, but not all of you do as I'm reading it, unless you've actually read it before. So this is kind of a fun feature of doing this. So all right, well, I'm not seeing any questions or comments, so I hope that all of you enjoyed this. And I think we'll probably end here. And we've got some other ones coming up down the line in the future. The only one that I've actually got on the calendar right now is one with Ursula K. Le Guin, The Rule of Names, but we'll have plenty of others. Dark Cat says, I arrived late. I have to go back and listen to you read the story. Yeah, that's, you can listen to it as many times as you want, and there's a whole playlist of the previous stories. Again, I'm picking out those that you can call them my favorites. They're ones that I keep going back to over and over and over again. And this is one that I've been thinking about, man, for over 4 decades, because I read it when I was a preteen, and I found it cool back then. But now knowing something about, people and dating and the social milieu that they're talking about, it takes on an additional resonance. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining me for this, and I will see you next time. And we got some other great stories coming up down the line. So have a great afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it happens to be where you are.